When Dr. Elijah Ward, a successful black surgeon, returns to his small hometown, he faces a corrupt sheriff and a rigged system determined to tear him down. Wrongfully arrested and humiliated under fabricated charges, Elijah becomes a target of racism and abuse of power. The sheriff's deep-seated prejudice and shady connections to local developers expose a web of corruption that threatens innocent families. As Elijah fights back, the story reveals infuriating truths about systemic racism in America, injustice, and the struggles Black Americans face simply for standing up to those who abuse their authority. It was supposed to be a normal day. Marcus Bennett, a 32-year-old black lawyer with a reputation for meticulous work and an unshakable resolve, was finally taking a break from his demanding caseload. For the first time in months, Marcus allowed himself the luxury of a slow afternoon. Dressed casually, in a white button-up shirt and dark slacks, he parked his silver sedan in front of Maple Grove Mall, a bustling suburban shopping center he'd often passed but never visited. Inside, the hum of conversations and the clang of shopping carts provided an oddly calming backdrop. Marcus wandered the electronics store, his eyes scanning rows of gadgets he didn't really need. He smiled faintly at a kid excitedly tugging his father toward the game consoles. Moments like these, simple and ordinary, felt rare for someone whose days were spent dissecting cases, arguing motions, and fighting battles in courtrooms. Marcus loved his work, but today, he just wanted to be invisible. A man on his day off. No fights, no arguments, just peace. Except peace never lasted long. Outside the store, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from his sister. "Don't forget Mom's dinner tonight at 7. He glanced at his watch. Still plenty of time. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, Marcus stepped out of the store and headed toward his car. The late afternoon sun beat down on the lot, shimmering off rows of parked vehicles. As he reached for his keys, he noticed a man across the lot, pale, middle-aged, wearing a red cap, pointing directly at him. "That's him!" the man shouted. Marcus froze, keys still in hand, confusion knitting his brow. He looked around, unsure who the man was talking to. That's when he saw them. Two police officers emerging from a patrol car parked a few rows over. They moved quickly, their heavy boots thudding against the asphalt as they closed the distance. "Hey!" one of the officers barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Step away from the car!" Marcus turned, brows furrowed. "Is there a problem, officer?" The second officer, stockier with a stern expression, already had a hand resting on his holstered weapon. "We got a report about a car theft matching this description." "Step back, sir." "A car theft?" Marcus repeated, incredulous. He gestured toward his car. "This is my vehicle. There's got to be a mistake." The officers exchanged a look. The man in the red cap had now approached, his voice loud and breathless. "I saw him trying to get in. That's the guy, I swear it." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. His calm demeanor wavered as his mind began calculating. He'd heard enough stories like this to know how quickly things could escalate. Keep your hands visible. Don't make any sudden movements. These were instincts ingrained in him over a lifetime. "Officers," Marcus said slowly, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of cooperation. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm a lawyer. This car is registered in my name." The taller officer's lips curled slightly, skeptical. "A lawyer, huh? You got ID to prove that?" "Of course," Marcus replied, reaching carefully toward his pocket. But the stocky officer's hand snapped up. "Don't move!" he barked, his voice rising. "Hands where we can see them!" The knot in Marcus's stomach tightened into a sharp pang. Around them, the parking lot had begun to still. Shoppers slowed their steps, some pausing altogether. He could feel their eyes, some curious, others wary. One woman across the lot was holding up her phone, already recording. "Are you serious?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "I told you, this is my car, I have the paperwork." "Turn around," the taller officer cut in, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You're being detained until we can sort this out." "Detained?" Marcus repeated, his disbelief giving way to anger. His heart pounded as he fought to maintain control. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Yeah?" the stocky officer sneered. "Then why are you acting nervous?" "I'm not." "Hands behind your back," the officer snapped, stepping forward aggressively. Marcus's chest tightened. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore, it was spiraling. He'd spent years studying the law, arguing cases, and defending others against injustices, just like this. And now here he was, living it. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. Phones were out, faces were watching. The tension was palpable. This wasn't supposed to happen. And yet, as Marcus felt the cold steel of handcuffs snap around his wrists, one thought burned in his mind. How many times does this have to happen before something changes? The early morning sun streamed through the sheer curtains of the penthouse suite, filling the space with a soft golden glow. Dr. Elijah Ward sat at his modest kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee cradled between his large, calloused hands. He loved this part of the day, the quiet before the chaos. A worn paperback lay open next to his cup, its pages smudged and dog-eared from countless readings. Despite his wealth, Elijah had never lost his appreciation for the simple things: old books, strong coffee, and silence. At 42, Elijah Ward was one of the most renowned cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, the kind of name that appeared on plaques in hospital wings and invitations to conferences in far-off cities. People whispered his name with reverence in medical circles, marveling at his skill, his precision. But if you were to meet Elijah outside the hospital, you might mistake him for someone else entirely. No flashy suits or sports cars. Today, like most Saturdays, he wore faded jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and the same worn sneakers he'd had for years. "Dad, you're gonna wear those again?" His daughter Jasmine had teased that morning as she stuffed her soccer cleats into a duffel bag. "They still work, don't they?" Elijah had replied, grinning as he waved her off. Jasmine had rolled her eyes, but her smile said it all. This was just who he was. Elijah glanced at the clock. 9:15. He had promised himself this would be a day off. No surgeries, no hospital calls, no meetings with hospital board members who rarely understood what it was like on the operating floor. Just a quiet drive out to the small town of Fairview, where he'd grown up. He made the trip every few months, sometimes to see his old neighbor Mrs. Thompson, sometimes just to clear his head. Fairview was his anchor, a simple town with red brick storefronts and slow-moving people who'd lived there all their lives. In the quiet of the kitchen, Elijah stood, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. Fairview was about an hour from the bustling city Elijah now called home, but the moment he turned onto its two-lane streets, time seemed to slow. The gas stations were still manned by teenagers who pumped fuel for you, and the corner store hadn't changed its sign since 1975. The roads wound through fields of overgrown grass and barns, weathered by time, until Elijah finally rolled to a stop in front of Joe's Diner. It had been here for decades, a squat little place with a peeling blue sign, metal stools by the counter, and a bell that chimed whenever the door swung open. Elijah stepped inside, the familiar smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee wrapping around him like a warm blanket. The diner wasn't busy. A few locals sat scattered across booths, nursing cups of coffee or plates of greasy eggs. An elderly man dozed at the far end of the counter, his cap pulled low over his eyes. Sliding onto a stool, Elijah smiled at the waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a kind face. Her name tag read, Linda. "Morning," Elijah said, his deep baritone voice soft as he glanced up at the menu chalkboard. Linda squinted at him, her brow knitting slightly as she took in his plain clothes and weary appearance. "Morning coffee?" "Yes, ma'am, and a stack of pancakes. It's been too long since I've had good pancakes." Linda smiled faintly, scribbling his order onto a notepad before moving down the counter. Elijah let his eyes wander around the diner as he waited. It was quiet, peaceful in the way only small-town diners could be. Through the window, he saw a group of teenagers riding their bikes past, their laughter trailing behind them. It reminded him of when he was a boy here, back when Fairview still felt like home. The bell above the door chimed again, and two men walked in. They were middle-aged, white, with the confident gait of people who'd lived in the same town their whole lives. Both wore sheriff's department uniforms. Elijah didn't pay them much mind as they took seats in a booth across the room, though he could feel their eyes flick toward him briefly. It was nothing new. "Here you go, hun." Linda returned with his coffee, setting it in front of him with a small ceramic clink. Elijah thanked her, wrapping his hands around the cup. He let its warmth seep into him, soothing the lingering tightness in his shoulders. He heard the murmur of conversation from the booth where the two officers sat. It was quiet, almost hushed, but Elijah could feel it, the unmistakable prickle of being watched. He'd spent enough years navigating hospitals and boardrooms to recognize it when people sized him up, trying to figure out where he fit. Linda reappeared moments later with his pancakes. "Here you are, fresh off the griddle." "They look perfect," Elijah said warmly. Linda lingered for a moment, glancing at the officers before turning back to Elijah. Her voice dropped slightly. "They've been on edge all week, some trouble with break-ins, I think. Just a heads up." Elijah nodded, offering her a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks for letting me know." The pancakes were good, fluffy, sweet, just like he remembered. He took his time eating, savoring every bite. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the street. When Elijah finally stood, he left a $20 bill beneath his empty plate and grabbed his keys. As he walked toward the door, he heard it. A voice, low but sharp, from across the room. "Hey, hold on a second." Elijah paused, turning to see one of the officers, broad-shouldered, with a hard-set jaw, rise from the booth. His badge caught the light as he moved, a gleaming silver star against the drab brown of his uniform. "Something wrong?" Elijah asked, his tone polite but firm. The officer stopped a few feet away, his eyes flicking from Elijah's face to his clothes. "You just passing through?" Elijah glanced toward the other officer, who remained seated, but watched the exchange with open interest. "I grew up here," Elijah replied evenly. "Just came for breakfast." The officer's brow furrowed, his expression skeptical. "Haven't seen you around before." "It's been a while." "Mind if I ask what kind of car you're driving?" Elijah felt the weight of the question settle over him like a heavy coat. "Silver Mercedes, parked right out front." There was a flicker in the officer's eyes, a flash of something Elijah recognized all too well. He didn't need to ask why they were asking. Didn't need to guess what assumptions were simmering beneath the surface. "Something wrong with my car?" Elijah asked calmly. The officer shifted, his jaw tightening slightly. "We've had some reports break-in suspicious activity." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, the surgeon's confidence unshakable. "I've been here less than 30 minutes, eating pancakes at that counter. You're welcome to check." The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Linda stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting between Elijah and the officers. The few other customers had gone quiet, their forks paused mid-air, as they watched the scene unfold. Finally, the second officer stood, his expression less certain than his partner's. "It's probably nothing, Mike," he muttered. Mike didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on Elijah, searching for something that wasn't there. Finally, he grunted, stepping back. "Enjoy your day." Elijah held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. "You too." He turned and stepped out of the diner, the bell chiming softly as the door closed behind him. The air outside felt heavier now, the warmth of the morning sun tinged with a chill that hadn't been there before. Sliding into his car, Elijah gripped the steering wheel, exhaling slowly. His heart wasn't racing, his hands weren't shaking, but the weight of the encounter lingered in his chest. How many times had he been here before? How many times would he have to prove who he was? As he pulled out of the parking lot, Elijah caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face of a man who had spent his life rising above expectations, only to be pulled back by the assumptions of others. And this was just the beginning. Elijah drove in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space where his thoughts churned. The diner incident shouldn't have rattled him. He'd dealt with worse. But it lingered. It always lingered. Every look, every insinuation, every unwarranted question. He wasn't naive. He knew what those officers saw. A black man driving a Mercedes, wearing worn jeans and an old t-shirt. To them, he didn't belong, not here, not anywhere they could imagine. The road stretched ahead, framed by sagging power lines and endless farmland. Elijah rolled down the window, letting the fresh air cool his face, but the knot in his chest remained. Don't let it get to you. It was something his father used to say whenever Elijah came home bruised, physically or otherwise, from a run-in with small-town ignorance. But his father's advice had always come with a warning. Stay calm, boy. They're waiting for a reason to bring you down. By mid-morning, Elijah arrived at the old Fairview courthouse, a squat, gray building with an air of forgotten authority. It hadn't changed in decades. The steps still cracked, the paint still peeling. He parked his car in the far lot, purposefully avoiding the spots closer to the entrance. He was here for one reason: Mrs. Thompson. Dorothy Thompson, his late mother's best friend and practically an aunt to him, had been embroiled in a property dispute. At 77 years old, she was trying to fight off a development company that wanted to buy her land for a discount and bulldoze her modest home to make way for a commercial strip. She had no lawyer, couldn't afford one, but Elijah had quietly promised to help however he could. Inside, the courthouse lobby was dimly lit and smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. A bored-looking clerk sat behind a cracked desk, and a few locals lounged on benches, waiting for their turn before the town judge. Elijah approached the clerk, a middle-aged white man with thinning hair and smudged glasses. He didn't look up as Elijah stepped to the counter. "Good morning," Elijah said with practiced politeness. "I'm here for the property hearing Mrs. Dorothy Thompson's case." The clerk barely glanced up, his eyes trailing from Elijah's face down to his clothes. "You her family or something?" "I'm representing her interests," Elijah replied evenly. "Dr. Elijah Ward." The man blinked, clearly surprised. "Doctor?" "Yes," Elijah said, his smile tight. "Is the hearing still scheduled for 10?" The clerk's lips thinned as he shuffled a few papers on his desk. "Yeah, it's on courtroom B. You'll need to wait with everyone else." "Thank you," Elijah replied, his voice cool. He turned and made his way to the worn wooden benches along the wall. He was used to that look, that barely veiled suspicion, as though someone like him couldn't possibly hold the title of doctor without explaining himself. He sat down and pulled out his phone to review his notes. The dispute wasn't complex. The developers had cut corners, failed to produce valid appraisals, and lowballed Mrs. Thompson because they assumed she didn't have the resources to fight back. Elijah had everything he needed to poke holes in their case. Minutes ticked by. People came and went. Conversations murmured softly through the room. Elijah kept his head down, though he could feel eyes flicking toward him every so often. "Can I help you?" Elijah looked up to see a man looming in front of him. Broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with thinning white hair and a badge pinned to his chest. Sheriff Paul Hastings. Elijah recognized the name instantly. Hastings had been sheriff for as long as he could remember, a fixture of Fairview's power structure. The man's pale blue eyes settled on Elijah with practiced scrutiny. "I'm fine, Sheriff," Elijah replied, meeting his gaze calmly. "Didn't ask if you were fine, asked if I could help you," Hastings said, his tone slow and measured. "I'm here for Mrs. Thompson's hearing," Elijah explained, sitting straighter, representing her interests. The sheriff's brow arched. "You a lawyer?" "A doctor," Elijah replied patiently. "But I'm here to help her as an advisor." The sheriff's gaze lingered on Elijah's face, then slid down to his plain clothes. "Doctors don't usually dress like that." Elijah's chest tightened. He forced a polite smile. "Is there a dress code I missed?" Hastings didn't smile back. "Just keeping an eye on things." Elijah bit back the words he wanted to say. He held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment before Hastings finally gave a small grunt and turned away, his boots thudding against the marble floor. Elijah exhaled slowly, his fingers curling tightly around his phone. Keep calm. It was always the same. Questions asked without being asked. Suspicion disguised as conversation. By the time the case was called, Elijah was ready. Courtroom B was small and stuffy, its walls lined with faded portraits of old judges whose names no one remembered. Mrs. Thompson sat nervously at the plaintiff's table, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized wooden chair. Elijah took the seat next to her, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're not alone in this, Mrs. Thompson," he murmured. "Thank you, Elijah," she whispered, patting his hand with her frail one. Across the room, the lawyer for the developers, a slick man in a tailored suit, glanced toward Elijah and smirked. Elijah ignored him. The judge entered. a balding man with a thick mustache and weary eyes. "Let's get this moving," he said, settling into his chair. "Who's representing the plaintiff?" "I am, Your Honor," Elijah said, standing. "Dr. Elijah Ward, acting as an advisor." The judge's gaze lifted slowly. He looked Elijah over, his eyes lingering just a second too long. "You're not a lawyer?" "No, sir. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "But I'm here to assist Mrs. Thompson." The judge snorted faintly. "Surgeon, huh? All right, fine. Let's see what you've got." Elijah sat, his face impassive, but the judge's tone hadn't escaped him. A surgeon helping with property disputes. It was as if his mere presence was an inconvenience. The developer's lawyer stood first, rattling off technical jargon and thin justifications for the low valuation. Elijah listened carefully, scribbling notes as the man droned on. When it was his turn, he stood, the room's eyes fixing on him again. "Your Honor, the appraisal presented by the developers is invalid," Elijah began calmly. "They failed to account for the true market value of Mrs. Thompson's land and home." As Elijah laid out his points, clear and methodical, he noticed the developer's lawyer growing uncomfortable. The judge, however, looked increasingly skeptical. "And how exactly do you know all this?" the judge interrupted. Elijah straightened. "I've reviewed property assessments, recent sales data, and legal precedents. The developers are attempting to exploit Mrs. Thompson's limited resources." The judge leaned back in his chair, squinting. "This isn't a medical operation, doctor. I'll decide what's valid." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. The words were subtle, but the condescension wasn't. "Stay calm. I trust you will, Your Honor," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "I simply want to ensure all the facts are considered." The judge didn't respond. He scribbled something on his notepad and waved his hand dismissively. "Recess for 15 minutes, he announced, standing abruptly. Elijah sank into his seat as the courtroom began to stir. He clenched his hands beneath the table, forcing himself to remain composed. He'd laid out a clear, factual argument, but the doubt in the judge's tone gnawed at him. "They don't care about the facts," Mrs. Thompson whispered beside him, her voice trembling. Elijah turned to her, softening. "It's not over yet. We'll keep fighting." But deep down, he felt it. The frustration, the helplessness of hitting a wall built not by laws, but by the people who wielded them. Across the room, the sheriff stood near the door, watching him again. The judge's dismissive tone, the sheriff's lingering gaze, the officers at the diner, all of it formed a pattern Elijah knew too well. To them, he didn't belong. Not in that diner, not in this courthouse, not anywhere they decided he shouldn't be. And yet, Elijah sat there, calm, resolute, knowing that this wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson's land anymore. It was about something much bigger. The courtroom buzzed faintly. As people whispered during the recess, Elijah sat at the plaintiff's table, his jaw set, his mind replaying every detail of the judge's dismissive tone and the sheriff's watchful gaze. He was used to being underestimated, ignored, or scrutinized, a black man in a room where he wasn't expected to be. But this was different. This wasn't just a snide comment or a look. This was power, tightly gripped and leveraged against him. Mrs. Thompson dabbed her eyes with a tissue beside him, her hands trembling as she whispered, "Elijah, they've already decided, haven't they? This ain't about no facts." Elijah leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. "We're not done, Mrs. Thompson. Let's see this through. I'll make them listen." But even as he reassured her, he felt the weight of the fight pressing harder. The judge's doubt, the developer's smirk, the sheriff's presence. They weren't coincidences. They were connected, all part of a system that thrived on silencing people like Mrs. Thompson. He was about to rise and stretch when Sheriff Hastings reappeared, his looming frame casting a shadow over their table. "Dr. Ward, step outside with me for a moment." Elijah looked up, meeting Hastings' pale blue stare. "Is there an issue?" The sheriff's voice lowered, tinged with something unspoken. "Step outside, sir, now." Mrs. Thompson's head snapped up. "What for, he ain't done nothing?" Elijah held up a calming hand. "It's all right, Mrs. Thompson. I'll be right back." He stood slowly, his every move measured. Hastings turned and led him through the double doors, past murmuring onlookers. The hallway was empty, save for another deputy leaning casually against the wall, a younger man with a nervous expression Elijah hadn't noticed before. Hastings stopped just outside the courtroom and turned to face Elijah, his tone tight and cold. "We had a call come in about a suspicious individual matching your description, a Mercedes parked illegally." "Some concerns about—" "You're serious," Elijah interrupted, disbelief cutting through his composure. "Suspicious individual, I parked in the public lot. If this is about a ticket, just write it." Hastings stepped closer, his frame an imposition. "I don't like your attitude. Doctor, lot of folks around here don't know you, and you've been stirring things up." Elijah's pulse quickened, but his face remained calm. He knew this script. He'd heard it before, in parking lots, at airports, on streets he had every right to walk. "I'm representing Mrs. Thompson. That's all. If you have a problem with me helping her, Sheriff, just say it." The younger deputy shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Hastings. "Sheriff, maybe we—" Hastings silenced him with a look, then turned back to Elijah. "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here, acting like you own the place. And what exactly does that mean?" Elijah's voice was steady, his eyes locked with Hastings. Hastings didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice to a murmur. "People like you come in here with your fancy cars and big titles, thinking you can tell us how to run things, but you're out of your depth, son." The word hit Elijah like a slap, but he refused to flinch. He straightened, his broad shoulders squared, every inch the man who had held patients' lives in his hands. "I've heard enough," Elijah said coldly. "If you have no legal reason to detain me, I'll be going back to the hearing." Hastings smirked faintly, as if daring Elijah to challenge him further. "Fine, go on back, but don't think I'm not watching you." "Watch all you want," Elijah shot back. "Just don't expect me to disappear." He turned sharply and walked back into the courtroom, his hands clenched at his sides. The younger deputy hesitated before following Hastings, his expression conflicted as he glanced back toward Elijah. Inside, the hearing resumed, but Elijah's mind was racing. He focused on the lawyer's slick arguments, countering them point by point with calm precision, but beneath his professional demeanor, anger simmered. "They're watching you. They're waiting for you to slip." Hastings' words echoed in his mind. It wasn't paranoia, he knew what was happening. The sheriff's intimidation wasn't about Elijah breaking a rule. It was about Elijah being here. It was a warning. Know your place. By the time the judge called for closing statements, Elijah's resolve was steely. He stood tall and delivered the final argument, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson isn't asking for favors, she isn't asking for special treatment, she's asking for fairness. The developers have used incomplete data and bad faith practices to undervalue her property. It's not just unethical, it's illegal. This isn't just a case about land, it's about whether this court will let someone like Mrs. Thompson be pushed aside, ignored, and forgotten because she doesn't have the resources to fight back. But she's not alone anymore, and I'll make sure her voice is heard." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. The judge avoided Elijah's gaze as he muttered, "Case adjourned. Decision will be delivered in 2 days." Elijah sat beside Mrs. Thompson as the judge left the bench. "You did good, Elijah," she said softly. "But you saw his face, he don't care." Elijah exhaled slowly. "We'll see." Outside, the courthouse steps were bathed in harsh sunlight. Elijah led Mrs. Thompson to his car, but as he opened the passenger door for her, he noticed something strange. A tow truck sat idling at the far end of the lot. Sheriff Hastings stood next to it, arms folded. Elijah's heart sank. "What's happening?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice trembling. Elijah walked briskly toward the sheriff, keeping his tone firm but measured. "What's going on here?" Hastings turned slowly, his expression smug. "Violation of local parking regulations, I'm having it towed." Elijah glanced at his car, perfectly parked between faded lines. "It's not illegally parked. This is harassment, and you know it." "Watch your tone, Doctor," Hastings said, his voice sharp. "You're in no position to accuse anyone of anything." The tow truck driver hesitated, clearly unsure whether to proceed. Leave it alone, Elijah said to him, his voice low and commanding. This isn't about the car. Hastings stepped forward, his face inches from Elijah's. You think you can waltz in here, stir up trouble, and walk away untouched? Elijah held his ground, his voice steady, but seething with restrained anger. Is that what this is about, a warning? Because I'm helping someone you'd rather see lose everything? Hastings smiled faintly, his gaze cold. No, son. It's about respect, and you're fresh out of it. A crowd was beginning to gather, locals, courthouse staff, even the younger deputy who looked increasingly uneasy as he watched the exchange phones appeared, hands holding them up discreetly. Is there a problem here, Sheriff? Came a voice from behind. Both men turned to see Mitchell Dean, a gruff but fair attorney Elijah had known in passing. He was walking toward them, his sharp eyes flicking between Hastings and Elijah. No problem, Hastings muttered, though his jaw tightened. I'll take it from here, Mitchell said firmly, stepping up beside Elijah. This car's not being towed today, Paul. The tension crackled in the air as Hastings glared at Mitchell, then at Elijah. Finally, he stepped back, jerking his thumb toward the tow truck driver. Get out of here. The truck rumbled to life and pulled away, leaving Hastings alone on the asphalt. This isn't over, he muttered as he turned and strode back toward the courthouse. Mitchell let out a slow breath, turning to Elijah. Are you all right? Elijah nodded, though his hands were still clenched. Thanks for stepping in. Mitchell studied him carefully. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, you know that? I'm not backing down, Elijah said quietly. Not now. Mitchell nodded slowly. Then you're going to need more than just words. Hastings and his people play dirty. I'm ready, Elijah replied, his voice firm. If they want to come at me, let them. As he helped Mrs. Thompson into the car, Elijah's gaze lingered on Hastings' retreating form. The fight had escalated, and there was no turning back. Whatever came next, Elijah knew one thing for certain. They had underestimated him. And they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The drive back to the city felt endless. Elijah's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white, though his face remained composed. The tension from the courthouse lingered like smoke in his lungs, thick and suffocating. Sheriff Hastings' words echoed in his mind, each one a subtle dagger. People like you. Fresh out of respect. He knew what this was. He'd been through it too many times before to mistake it for coincidence. Hastings wasn't just protecting the developers. He was protecting the old systems that Fairview had always clung to. It didn't matter that Elijah was a doctor. It didn't matter that he was there to help someone who couldn't fight for herself. The moment he walked into that courtroom, he'd been labeled outsider, troublemaker, a black man out of place. They're going to push until I push back. Elijah exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm, but beneath the measured breath was a rising fire. That evening, Elijah sat on his living room couch, laptop open, reviewing every scrap of evidence on Mrs. Thompson's case. Property assessments, fraudulent developer bids, and questionable permits. It was all there, buried beneath layers of legal jargon and procedural filings. The corruption wasn't just careless, it was deliberate. The developers were in bed with Fairview's local officials, manipulating paperwork and undervaluing land to push families like Mrs. Thompson off their properties. And now, Hastings was the muscle behind it. Elijah. He looked up to see his wife, Ava, standing in the doorway. She wore an oversized sweater, her dark curls framing her face, concern written in her eyes. You've been at it for hours, she said softly. What's going on? Elijah sighed and closed the laptop. It's worse than I thought. The sheriff, the developers, they're all connected. It's not just about Mrs. Thompson's land. It's happening to other families too. People who can't afford to fight back. Ava moved to sit beside him, resting a hand on his knee. And you're planning to take them all on by yourself? If I have to. Elijah leaned back, the weight of it all pressing against his chest. Someone has to. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. You know what they're capable of. Hastings isn't going to stop at intimidation, Elijah. I know, Elijah said quietly. But if I back down, they win. Ava squeezed his knee gently, her voice low. Then you don't stand alone. Elijah looked at her, the fire in her eyes steadying him. "Thank you," he murmured. "Always," Ava replied. The next morning, Elijah's phone buzzed with a call from Mitchell Dean. "I did some digging after yesterday," Mitchell said, his voice tense. "You were right. Hastings is dirty. His brother-in-law is part owner of that development company. This whole thing's a setup." Elijah rubbed his temple. "Figures what else?" Mitchell hesitated. "They're gearing up to come after you. I don't know what they'll try, but Hastings doesn't play fair. Be careful, Elijah." "I'm not afraid of him," Elijah replied, though his chest tightened at the warning. "I know you're not, but you need to be smart. You can't fight this alone. I'm working on getting the state attorney's office to pay attention to what's happening in Fairview, but it's slow. You have to be ready for them to push back hard." "Understood," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Thanks, Mitchell." Mitchell sighed. "Keep your head up, Doc." That pushback came faster than Elijah expected. By mid-afternoon, he was in his office at the hospital, halfway through reviewing a patient's chart, when his assistant burst in, her face pale. "Dr. Ward, there are police officers here to see you." Elijah frowned, standing slowly. "A police? What for?" "They didn't say, but they're in the lobby, asking for you by name." Elijah's heart sank. He knew. He knew before he even stepped out of his office. The hospital lobby was bustling with staff and patients, but all the noise seemed to fade when Elijah spotted the two officers, Hastings and the nervous young deputy, standing just inside the glass doors. Hastings wore a smug expression, his hand resting lazily on his belt. "Dr. Ward," Hastings said, his voice carrying across the lobby. Heads turned, curious glances followed, as people paused to watch the scene unfold. Elijah approached calmly, holding his composure as he always did. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "You're under arrest." The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the lobby. A nurse dropped a clipboard. Elijah's face betrayed nothing. "On what grounds?" "Fraud," Hastings said, his tone dripping with triumph. "Property tampering, forging legal documents, someone filed a complaint." "That's absurd," Elijah shot back, his voice level but sharp. "You know that's a lie." Hastings grinned faintly. "Tell it to the judge." He nodded toward the deputy, who hesitated but stepped forward, holding a pair of handcuffs. "You're making a mistake," Elijah said firmly, looking Hastings in the eye. "This is harassment, and you know it." "Take it up with the court, Doc," Hastings replied. The deputy looked visibly uncomfortable as he reached for Elijah's wrists. "I'm sorry, sir." Elijah didn't resist. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering as the cold metal snapped shut around his wrists. Whispers swirled around him, people murmuring his name, his title. "Dr. Ward." "What's happening?" Elijah turned his head slightly as Hastings leaned in close, his voice a low, smug murmur. "I told you, son, you don't belong here." The police cruiser's ride back to Fairview was long and silent. Elijah sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the rolling fields blurred past. His wrists ached from the cuffs, but it was nothing compared to the simmering anger burning in his chest. They thought this would break him. Hastings, the developers, whoever had orchestrated this sham. They thought dragging his name through the mud, parading him in handcuffs, would silence him. They were wrong. By the time they arrived at the Fairview station, a small crowd had already gathered outside. Word had spread. Elijah Ward, the prominent surgeon, hauled in like a common criminal. As the deputy led him through the doors, Elijah kept his head high, refusing to shrink under the weight of their stares. Inside, Hastings was waiting, leaning against the front desk with a look of pure satisfaction. "Take him to the holding cell," Hastings ordered, ignoring Elijah completely. The deputy hesitated. "But Sheriff..." "I said take him," Hastings barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young man swallowed hard, leading Elijah down a dim hallway lined with peeling paint and flickering lights. The holding cell was small and claustrophobic, the metal bench hard against the wall. "Do you need anything, sir?" the deputy asked quietly, his voice laced with guilt. Elijah turned to him, his gaze steady. "I need you to think about the role you're playing in this." The deputy froze, his face reddening. He didn't answer as he turned and left, the door clanging shut behind him. Elijah sat down on the bench, the cold steel biting into him. He leaned forward, his hands still cuffed, his mind racing. They wanted him humiliated, they wanted him to feel powerless. Instead, they'd handed him something far more valuable: proof. He wasn't alone. Either Ava would know something was wrong soon, and Mitchell would hear about it. Hastings had overplayed his hand, and Elijah wasn't going to let this end here. This wasn't defeat, it was fuel. And when he walked out of this cell, Hastings and everyone behind him were going to regret underestimating Elijah Ward. Elijah sat on the cold metal bench, his wrists throbbing from the too tight handcuffs, though the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the fire building in his chest. The holding cell was dimly lit, a flickering fluorescent light buzzing overhead like a mosquito in a quiet room. He leaned his head back against the cement wall, closing his eyes. Focus. Hastings had finally shown his hand, the unjust arrest, the fabricated charges. It wasn't about the law, and Elijah knew it. It was about power. It was about making an example of someone like him, a man who didn't know his place. His thoughts were interrupted by the clanging of the heavy metal door. Footsteps echoed down the hall, deliberate and sharp. Elijah didn't have to look up to know who it was. Sheriff Hastings stepped into view, his boots stopping just outside the bars. "How's it feel, Doc?" he sneered, his voice dripping with triumph. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Elijah opened his eyes slowly, his face calm, betraying nothing. "I'm not the one abusing my power, Sheriff." Hastings's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before it returned, tighter this time. "You talk a big game for someone sitting in a cell. Fraud, tampering, obstruction. Those charges stick. You'll be lucky to get out in 5 years. Elijah sat forward, resting his cuffed hands on his knees. His gaze pinned Hastings in place. "And what happens when those charges fall apart? What happens when the truth comes out?" Hastings chuckled darkly, though there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Uncertainty. "You think anyone's gonna listen to you? You think anyone's gonna care? You're just another outsider trying to tell us how to run things." Elijah didn't blink. "I'm not the outsider here. I grew up in Fairview. I know this town, the people in it, and I know the kind of man you are, Sheriff. You've built your career on fear, on intimidation, but you made a mistake when you came after me." Hastings' face darkened. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "I know enough," Elijah said, his voice sharp but steady. "Your brother-in-law owns half of that development company, doesn't he? You've been running interference for them, pushing families like Mrs. Thompson off their land, lining your pockets in the process." Hastings' jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You don't have proof." "Oh, I will," Elijah replied, leaning back with the confidence of a man who knew he was on the right side of the fight. "It's already in motion. The state attorney's office will have their hands full when this gets out, and it will get out." Hastings gripped the bars tightly, his knuckles turning white. For the first time, Elijah saw it. The cracks in the man's armor. Hastings wasn't invincible. He was a man with everything to lose, and Elijah had just struck at the heart of it. "You think you're smarter than me?" Hastings hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I'm just gonna let you waltz out of here and ruin everything I've built?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "You're not the first man to think he can silence the truth. But let me be very clear, Sheriff. You're not going to win this." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Hastings' face flushed red, his breathing sharp and angry. For a moment, Elijah thought he might lash out instead. Hastings straightened, fixing Elijah with a venomous glare. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You don't know what you're starting." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "I know exactly what I'm starting. The question is, do you?" The next hour crawled by. Elijah sat in silence, his mind racing through contingencies. Mitchell must know by now. Ava would be calling everyone she could. The state attorney's office had the evidence Hastings had overplayed his hand, and Elijah knew it. But would it be enough? Would the system work the way it was supposed to? The door opened again. This time, it was the younger deputy, the one who'd cuffed him. He stepped into the cell block, his expression tense and uncertain. He hesitated in front of the door, his keys jangling faintly. "Deputy?" Elijah said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "You know this isn't right." The deputy swallowed, looking down at the cuffs, and then back at Elijah. "Sheriff Hastings, he's not someone you want to cross." Elijah's gaze softened. "That doesn't make what he's doing any less wrong. You're better than this." The young man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elijah wasn't sure he'd respond. Then, with a sigh, the deputy unlocked the door. The metal groaned as it swung open. "Come on," the deputy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." Elijah stood, holding his wrists out. The deputy unlocked the handcuffs, looking around nervously. "I'll say you asked to make a phone call," he muttered. "But you need to move fast." Elijah nodded, his voice calm. "Thank you." Elijah's phone call was to Mitchell. The moment the attorney picked up, Elijah's voice was steady, but the urgency was clear. "They've arrested me on false charges. Hastings is behind it," Elijah said. "We don't have time. We need to move." "I'm already on it," Mitchell replied, his voice tight. "I've been talking to people at the state attorney's office all morning. They're ready to step in, but we need public pressure to make it stick." "Then we give them something they can't ignore," Elijah said firmly. 30 minutes later, Elijah was being led back to the lobby of the station, Hastings waiting for him with a smug grin. "Going somewhere, doctor?" Hastings drawled. Elijah held his gaze, calm and steady. "You're running out of time, Sheriff." Before Hastings could respond, the front doors burst open. Cameras flashed, reporters poured in, microphones in hand. Mitchell Dean entered first, his sharp voice cutting through the chaos. "Dr. Elijah Ward is being held on fabricated charges," Mitchell said to the gathered press. "And we have evidence of corruption within this department. Sheriff Hastings has overstepped his authority, and the state attorney's office is now involved." Hastings' face turned ashen. "Get them out of here," he barked to his deputies, but it was too late. The reporters were rolling, cameras trained on Hastings, as Mitchell held up copies of documents, property records, false appraisals, and the clear connection between Hastings and the developers. "This is a targeted campaign to intimidate and silence those who stand up against corruption," Mitchell continued, "and it ends today." Elijah stepped forward, his voice calm but powerful. "Sheriff Hastings, you've abused your power for long enough. This is what happens when you think no one's watching." Hastings lunged forward, his face twisted with rage, but deputies held him back. "You think this changes anything?" Hastings shouted. "You won't win." Elijah turned to face the cameras, his voice carrying through the room. "This isn't just about me. This is about every family that's been pushed out of their homes, every voice that's been silenced. The truth is coming out, and no matter how hard you fight, you can't stop it." The room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, deputies scrambling to contain the fallout. Hastings' face was pale now, sweat dotting his brow as his empire began to crack. Elijah stood tall, the fire in his chest, now a steady burn. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for Mrs. Thompson, for his hometown, for justice. As Hastings was led away, shouting empty threats, Elijah's gaze didn't waver. This was far from over, but for the first time, Hastings was on the defensive. The truth had clawed its way to the surface, and Elijah Ward was just getting started. The holding cell was quiet now, save for the faint hum of a flickering light and the occasional creak of a distant door. Elijah sat on the edge of the metal bench, his elbows on his knees, staring at the cold cement floor as he thought through his next move. The door groaned open, echoing down the empty corridor. Elijah didn't look up. He already knew who it was. Sheriff Paul Hastings stepped inside the cell block, his heavy boots scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. When he finally stopped outside Elijah's cell, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he leaned one arm against the bars and stared down at Elijah, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "Comfortable?" Hastings asked, his voice thick with mockery. Elijah lifted his head slowly, his calm expression unshaken. "Is this the part where you gloat?" Hastings chuckled darkly. "Something like that. Thought I'd come see for myself how a man like you looks when he finally realizes he's beaten." "I'm not beaten, Sheriff," Elijah replied evenly. "Not by a long shot." Hastings's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "You still don't get it, do you?" You think you can come into my town, make a mess of things, and walk away untouched? He shook his head, his voice dropping to a low growl. You've been a thorn in my side since the minute you set foot here, you and your big city arrogance, thinking you're better than the rest of us. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. This isn't about me, Sheriff. This is about you. You think you own this town, but you're nothing more than a bully with a badge. Hastings' face flushed with anger. Watch your mouth. I will, when you start listening, Elijah shot back, rising to his feet. He stepped closer to the bars, his broad frame imposing even in the small cell. You think you're invincible, but you're not. You've gotten away with it for years. Intimidation, corruption, driving people out of their homes. But you slipped up, you came after me, and now everyone will see exactly who you are. Hastings glared at him, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. You're nothing, Ward. A fraud who's gotten too big for his own good. You think anyone's going to believe you? My word carries weight in this town. Yours doesn't mean a damn thing. Not anymore, Elijah said, his voice like steel. You arrested me on false charges, but I'm not the only one watching my attorneys already talking to the state. You've made this too big to bury. Hastings hesitated for half a second, the flicker of doubt in his eyes betraying him. It was all Elijah needed to see. I have the proof, Elijah continued, his voice quiet but unrelenting. Your connection to the developers. Your brother-in-law's stake in the land grabs. It's all there. Property appraisals, altered records, intimidation tactics. You think you've won. You've just made yourself the face of everything that's wrong with this town. The silence that followed was heavy and thick, the tension filling the small space between them. Hastings' face turned crimson, his composure slipping with every word Elijah said. You don't know who you're dealing with, Hastings spat finally, his voice cracking with rage. No, Elijah said, his eyes locking onto Hastings. You don't know who you're dealing with. Hastings slammed his palm against the bars, the sound reverberating through the block. You think this ends with you walking out of here? You're not getting out of this, I'll make sure of it. At that moment, a voice echoed down the hallway. Sheriff? Both men turned as the younger deputy, Tim, Elijah remembered, stepped cautiously into view. His face was pale, and there was an edge of nervousness to his voice. Sheriff, we've got a situation outside. Hastings' eyes narrowed. What situation? Tim swallowed, his gaze flicking toward Elijah before looking back at the sheriff. It's the press, sir, and a lawyer, Mitchell Dean. He's outside with reporters, and they're asking questions about Dr. Ward's arrest, about the charges. Hastings turned sharply on his heel. I'll handle it. The deputy didn't move. Sir, they're saying the state attorney's office has been contacted. They're calling for your suspension pending investigation. Elijah didn't miss the way Hastings' shoulders tensed. For the first time, the cracks in his armor became unmistakable. Hastings turned back toward Elijah, his expression a storm of anger and panic. You did this, Hastings growled, pointing a finger at Elijah. No, Elijah said, his voice steady. You did this, I just exposed it. For a long moment, Hastings stared at him, breathing heavily, as if he were on the verge of exploding. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed down the hall, his boots echoing as he disappeared from view. The deputy lingered, glancing nervously between the cell and the retreating figure of the sheriff. He exhaled slowly and stepped toward the door. You okay, Dr. Ward? He asked quietly. Elijah nodded, his posture relaxing for the first time since Hastings appeared. I will be. Tim hesitated again, then pulled a ring of keys from his belt. They're going to get you out of here, he said, unlocking the cell. Mitchell's outside raising hell. You've got a lot of people backing you now. Elijah stepped out of the cell, rolling his shoulders as the tension slowly began to dissipate. Thank you, deputy. Tim lowered his gaze, guilt etched into his face. I should have said something earlier about Hastings about all of it. It's not too late, Elijah replied. The right thing always matters, no matter when you decide to do it. Tim nodded slowly, his face resolute now. I'll make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The scene outside the station was chaos. Reporters crowded near the steps, microphones in hand, cameras rolling. Elijah stepped through the doors into the late afternoon sun, blinking as the flashbulbs went off like fireworks. Mitchell was waiting for him at the edge of the crowd, his voice booming as he addressed the media. "This is corruption. Plain and simple, Sheriff Hastings fabricated charges against Dr. Ward in a desperate attempt to protect his own interests. But the truth is out now. The state attorney's office has already launched an investigation, and we intend to hold every single person involved accountable." The reporters swarmed toward Elijah the moment they spotted him. "Dr. Ward, how do you respond to these allegations? What are your next steps? Will you press charges against the sheriff?" Elijah raised his hand, the crowd quieting as his deep voice carried above the noise. "This was never just about me," he began, his tone calm but firm. "This was about people like Mrs. Thompson, good people, being driven out of their homes by those who abuse their power. Sheriff Hastings thought he could intimidate me into silence, but he was wrong. I won't be silenced, and I won't stop fighting for justice. Not for me, but for every family that's been wronged." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of questions, but Elijah didn't stop. He turned to Mitchell, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," Mitchell said quietly. Elijah nodded, his jaw set. "No, it's not." As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, Elijah looked out over the crowd. There were faces he recognized, people from Fairview, neighbors, families, young and old. Some stood quietly, their expressions filled with hope. Others raised fists, or nodded in solidarity. For the first time in days, Elijah felt the weight on his chest lift. Hastings' reign of fear was breaking apart, one crack at a time. The fight wasn't finished, but the tide had turned, and Elijah Ward was ready for whatever came next. The next 48 hours moved like a storm, swirling with chaos, revelations, and the beginnings of justice. Elijah stood at the center of it all, steady as an oak tree against the wind, but even he felt the weight of what had been set in motion. The state attorney's office wasted no time. After receiving Mitchell's documentation and the mounting media pressure, investigators arrived at the Fairview Sheriff's Department by noon. The front doors of the courthouse were plastered with reporters and camera crews. Deputies moved with downcast eyes, avoiding questions, while Sheriff Hastings' office remained ominously silent. Elijah watched it all unfold from Mitchell's small office in town, a steaming cup of coffee untouched in his hands. "They've cornered him," Mitchell said, standing by the window and watching the reporters through a gap in the blinds. "Hastings isn't talking to anyone. His lawyers already issued some pathetic statement about misunderstandings and protocol. It won't hold." Elijah's lips curled faintly into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It never does when the truth catches up." Mitchell turned, his expression softening. "You did this, Elijah? You forced their hand. He's done." "Maybe," Elijah replied quietly, his gaze distant. "But this isn't just about Hastings, it's about the system that let him get away with it for so long." Mitchell nodded, a note of respect in his voice. "We'll get there, one step at a time." Later that afternoon, the inevitable came. Sheriff Paul Hastings, pale and stiff-jawed, stood in front of the station steps, reporters pressing in like a pack of wolves. His lawyer hovered beside him, trying, and failing, to maintain control. "This office has always acted in the best interest of the community," Hastings declared, his voice tight as cameras rolled. "Any accusations of misconduct are being addressed, and I have full confidence that a fair review will clear my name." The words fell flat. The crowd wasn't buying it. The moment he turned to retreat inside, a reporter shouted, "Sheriff Hastings, what about the charges against Dr. Elijah Ward? Are they being dropped?" Hastings froze. For just a second, the mask slipped. Elijah, standing at the edge of the crowd with Mitchell, saw the fear flash in his eyes. "Dr. Ward," Hastings repeated bitterly, his voice carrying more venom than intended. "I'll leave that to the courts." "Not for long," Mitchell muttered beside Elijah. "That's a man who knows the walls are closing in." That evening, Elijah returned to the small, familiar porch of Mrs. Thompson's house. The sun was setting behind Fairview's horizon, throwing streaks of orange and gold across the sky. The old wooden rocking chair creaked softly as Mrs. Thompson swayed back and forth, her frail hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "You sure stirred up the hornet's nest, Elijah," she said, her voice holding a mix of awe and affection. Elijah leaned against the porch railing, his own mug in hand, looking out across her land. The fields, stretched far and wide, bathed in the soft evening light. For the first time in weeks, there was no sheriff to watch him, no menacing presence waiting to pounce. "I couldn't let them take this from you," Elijah replied softly, "or from anyone else." She turned her head toward him, her eyes glistening. "Your mama would have been proud, she always said you'd do something big for this world." Elijah smiled faintly, the words cutting through his armor and reaching the quiet places of his heart. "I just wish she were here to see it." "She is," Mrs. Thompson said firmly, "every step of the way." Elijah nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He'd fought this battle for her, for his mother, for the countless families like Mrs. Thompson who'd been pushed aside and ignored. And though it wasn't over, he felt a flicker of hope, a sign that the world could change, even if slowly. As they sat in the comfortable silence of the evening, a car pulled up the driveway, its headlights flicking off. Mitchell stepped out, holding a file in one hand and his phone in the other. "You're gonna like this," he called as he walked up the steps, waving the file. Elijah raised a brow. "What's that?" "News just broke," Mitchell said, handing Elijah the file. "The state attorney's office has opened a full investigation into the Fairview Sheriff's Department. They're freezing assets, digging into financials, and pulling deputies for questioning Hastings is finished." Elijah exhaled, the tension he hadn't realized he was still carrying slowly seeping from his shoulders. "Good. It's about time." Mitchell grinned. "Turns out, Sheriff Hastings wasn't just skimming with the developers. There are other complaints, wrongful arrests, intimidation tactics, the works, all of it's coming to light now." Mrs. Thompson let out a triumphant laugh, her voice ringing through the twilight air. "See there, God don't like ugly." Elijah chuckled softly. "No, he doesn't." Mitchell sobered, looking Elijah squarely in the eyes. "And the charges against you dropped officially." Elijah set the file down, nodding slowly. "Good." Mitchell studied him for a moment, then added, "The press is calling you a hero, Elijah. You've set something in motion that can't be stopped." Elijah shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Mitchell. I'm just a man doing what's right, and there's still work to do." Mitchell smiled faintly. "That's what makes you the hero." The next morning, news stations across the state aired footage of Sheriff Hastings being led from the Fairview Sheriff's Department in handcuffs. The charges included corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Elijah watched from his kitchen table, the screen muted as reporters recounted the details. He'd always imagined moments like this: victory, justice served. But in truth, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the first step. Ava walked in, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "It's finally happening," she said softly, looking at the screen. "Yeah," Elijah replied, his voice distant. "But it shouldn't have taken this much." She sat beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "You changed something, Elijah. You made them see, and now people are listening." Elijah turned to her, his expression softening. "For now. But what happens when they stop listening?" "Then we make them listen again," Ava said, her voice steady. "You showed them the truth, that's all any of us can do." Elijah nodded, the words settling deep. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for it. A week later, Elijah stood in the courthouse parking lot in Fairview. It felt different now, like a weight had been lifted, the air a little lighter. He looked up at the old building, its faded walls still the same. But now, change seemed possible. Mitchell joined him, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "You heading back to the city?" "Eventually," Elijah said, looking out across the street. "But I'm not done here yet." "What's next?" Elijah smiled faintly. "There's a lot of people in this town who need help. Families who've been ignored for too long. Mrs. Thompson was just the start. It's time to rebuild this place." Mitchell nodded, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Fairview's lucky to have you." "No," Elijah replied quietly, his gaze steady. "I'm lucky to have Fairview, this is home." As he turned to leave, Elijah caught sight of a group of young boys riding their bikes down the street, their laughter carrying through the air. For a moment, he saw himself in them, back when life had been simpler, when Fairview had felt like a safe place. It could be that way again. Elijah stepped toward his car, his mind already focused on the next steps. He didn't know how long the fight would last, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as injustice remained, he would stand against it, for his mother, for Mrs. Thompson, for everyone who had ever been silenced, and this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The town of Fairview looked the same as it always had. Red brick buildings, rusting storefront signs, and winding country roads. But something had shifted. It wasn't something you could touch or see. It was something you could feel in the air. The people moved differently. They spoke with a new kind of awareness, as though the veil that had hung over the town for so long had been lifted, even if only slightly. Elijah stood at the edge of Mrs. Thompson's porch, watching the sunrise spill gold across the fields. The quiet was peaceful, soothing in its simplicity. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't consumed by anger, frustration, or exhaustion. The weight he'd carried for weeks had eased, not lifted entirely, but light enough that he could breathe. The headlines had spread far beyond Fairview sheriff arrested in corruption scandal property. Grab exposed media outlets had dissected every piece of the story. Hastings' abuse of power, the developer's manipulation of property values, and Elijah's wrongful arrest. For some, it was just another news cycle. But for others, those who'd lived with the kind of injustice Elijah had fought against, it was proof that the fight wasn't hopeless. Mrs. Thompson, sitting beside him in her rocking chair, looked out over her land with a satisfied smile. "You saved this place, Elijah. And you saved me." Elijah turned to her, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "I didn't do it alone, you were stronger than they gave you credit for." She laughed softly. "Maybe, but I'm not the only one you gave people hope, Elijah. That counts for something." He nodded, her words settling deep in his chest. For weeks, he'd been driven by purpose, fueled by the injustice he couldn't let stand. But now that the dust had begun to settle, he saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson's home, or even about Sheriff Hastings. It was about something much larger. A fight against a system that had been built to keep people like them out. A fight that stretched far beyond the borders of this small town. Later that day, Elijah walked through the center of Fairview, his steps unhurried. The stares he received now were different. Some hesitant, others filled with quiet respect. People recognized him, not as an outsider or a threat, but as someone who had stood up when it mattered most. At the courthouse steps, a small gathering had formed. Townspeople holding signs, families standing shoulder to shoulder, and local activists speaking to reporters. The energy was different now. Focused, determined. Mitchell spotted Elijah from across the lot and waved him over. "Didn't think you'd show," Mitchell said, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Elijah shrugged. "I couldn't stay away." Mitchell gestured to the small but growing crowd. "They're pushing for a full review of the sheriff's department. It's going to take time, but it's a start. They've been quiet for too long." Elijah nodded. "Fairview deserves better. And it's getting better, because of you." Elijah shook his head. "It's not just me. People are finally starting to see the cracks. All I did was shine a light on what was already there." Mitchell grinned faintly. "You're too humble for your own good." Elijah looked at the families gathered near the steps, young children clinging to their parents' hands, elderly residents standing tall with quiet pride. "No," he said softly. "I just know this fight doesn't end here." That night, back at his home in the city, Elijah sat at his kitchen table once more. Ava was beside him, flipping through news articles on her tablet, while their two kids laughed and played in the next room. It was the kind of evening he'd missed. Peaceful, ordinary, a reminder of what mattered most. "You look like you're thinking too hard," Ava teased, nudging him gently. Elijah smiled faintly. "Just thinking about what comes next." "You mean Fairview?" "Fairview and everywhere else like it," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "The fight's not over. People like Hastings exist in every small town, every system that lets power go unchecked. What happened in Fairview was a victory, but there's still so much to fix." Ava set her tablet down, turning to him with a gentle but firm gaze. "You can't fix everything, Elijah." "I know," he admitted, exhaling softly. "But I can't ignore it. Either I've seen what happens when good people don't fight back, and I've seen what happens when they do." Ava smiled, pride and love in her eyes. Then keep fighting, and we'll keep standing with you. Elijah reached for her hand, holding it gently as the noise of their children playing echoed down the hall. I'm not stopping, he said quietly. Not until people like Mrs. Thompson, and people like us, don't have to fight just to be seen. The weeks turned into months. Hastings was stripped of his badge, indicted on multiple charges, and exposed for his role in the corrupt land grabs. The developers, no longer shielded, pulled out of Fairview entirely, leaving families like Mrs. Thompson's untouched. But the true victory wasn't just in the arrests or the headlines, it was in the shift that followed. Fairview began to change. Residents who had stayed quiet for years started asking questions, local leaders faced scrutiny, and new voices emerged to challenge the old systems. Community meetings, filled with people who wanted to be heard, families once silenced by fear, found their courage. Elijah visited often, each time greeted by faces that no longer looked at him with suspicion, but with gratitude. At one of those meetings, a young boy stopped him as he left the town hall. "Dr. Ward," the boy asked shyly, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Elijah crouched down so they were face to face. "That's me. What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy said. He paused, fidgeting with his hands. "I want to be like you one day. I want to help people." Elijah's chest tightened, a mix of pride and emotion rising inside him. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You don't have to wait until you're older to help people. You can start right now, by standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Marcus nodded, his smile wide. "I will." As Elijah straightened, he looked back at the boy, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Maybe the change he'd fought for was already beginning. In the quiet of his own home one evening, Elijah sat alone in his study, looking through an old photo album. There was a picture of him and his mother on Fairview's main street. He couldn't have been more than 10. His mother had always told him that one day he'd do something meaningful. Back then, he didn't know what she meant. Now, he understood. The world wasn't perfect. There were still men like Hastings, still systems that enabled them. There would always be battles to fight, voices to amplify, and truths to uncover. But Elijah knew now that change was possible, not easy, not quick, but possible. As he closed the photo album, he whispered softly to himself, "We're just getting started." The words carried in the quiet of the room, a promise not just to himself, but to everyone who needed someone to stand up and fight. The end.